So I recently finished my first year of university just a couple months ago, and that means that I am obviously finished with the American K through 12 school system. I've been through it, now I'm off to university. And I chose to go to university in Scotland because I thought it'd be wonderful to see Europe and travel and experience a lot of Western culture from Europe, from the source. And when I went to Europe, I found that a lot of the ideas and a lot of the issues that were persistent in American education and the formation of our students were present there as well. And I think that's a condemnation almost of the shift in Western culture and in Western education away from the classical model of education that has been tried and tested and formed over thousands of years from the ancient Greeks through the scholastics till the modern day. And we've abandoned it, and it's left our schools almost intellectually desolate in a sense. And what do I mean by that? Well, if we look at all of Western education throughout history, it's almost never been about job training or test scores or producing workers for the economy. But it's always had consistent themes, which are congruent with our culture. And a lot of these will probably sound familiar, even if you haven't heard a lot about classical education. So the main goal is stated in early and actually throughout all of it is to form free citizens who are whole persons. And that means people who pursue what is true, what is good, and what is beautiful. And that might sound very foreign to someone who has only been exposed to the K through 12 school system or just your standard models of Western education. But I want to propose from a student's perspective, because I just finished high school and I'm in college now at a university, and I am doing an English degree, but I'm not at a true liberal arts university. There are liberal arts universities. The school I'm at isn't one of them. And this is more so an argument as to, or even more so observations as to how education used to work and how it works now and how that affects me and my fellow students in the modern day. So the biggest difference with classical education and modern education has to do with tools of learning. And when you were in school, you probably had an example where you or one of your peers asked the teacher, why do we have to do this? Are we ever going to do this in real life? This is so impractical. And the teacher probably responded one of two ways. They either gave you some really weird niche example of how you're going to use it in real life that isn't true, and you know it's not true, like telling you you're going to use calculus because whenever you're doing grocery shopping you need to do math. Or the one that I'm going to focus on here is they told you you're just learning how to learn. And I always found that, as a student who had an interest in education from an early age, to be a ridiculous claim, because in schools when we're just doing standardized tests and memorizing, I'm not learning how to learn, I'm learning how to memorize and regurgitate. And none of what I'm saying here is new. I'm sure most of the people that have gone through the school system have similar views. So what's different about the classical education? Well, it starts with the foundations of learning, right? And those are called the trivium, and it originates from medieval scholasticism, where we have grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So why do we choose those? Well, it's funny we should say why, because that's another important aspect of classical education. In modern schools, we do ask how a lot. We ask how things work. And that's really good. You do have to ask how things work, and that's inquiry, that's curiosity, which is integral to learning. And tons of research shows that students who are curious are more likely to actually perform well and be interested and learn. But what we fail at is we never ask why anymore in our schools. And why is that important? Well, when you ask why, you truly have to test ideas at their core. And our modern school system doesn't give you the tools to do that. But in classical education, first, like I said, you learn the trivium. So you learn grammar. So you will become literate. It's not like you just strip the education of that. But you also almost have a mastery of the language by the end of it. Or at least you're rather proficient by the time you're getting into high school. You actually have an understanding of how they use our language. And then once you understand language, your comprehension goes up. And then you learn logic simultaneously. And when you learn logic, that's how you test ideas, because you can read and comprehend an idea, but that doesn't mean that you can test it. So when you use logic, you can actually look at these ideas and see whether they're good, true, or beautiful, but specifically true, because whenever you're using logical faculties, that's how you can actually compare these ideas with facts and reason to come to your own conclusions. Something that is completely missing in our modern school system. And so oftentimes criticisms of classical education have to do with claiming that classical education strips students of their individuality and makes them just read old books and just do what everyone's done for all of history. But rather, it actually teaches them to engage with ideas and then has them read most of the major ideas that formed our modern society and engage with all of them and form their own opinions with logic. And then once you can do that, then you need rhetoric, because rhetoric is how we communicate our ideas. And without rhetoric, we're not able to actually voice an opinion, and we're not able to take our comprehension or our mastery of grammar or our understanding of logic and do something with it, right? Because if you can't speak to someone, if you can't convey your ideas to someone else, then they're really useless. And so a lot of times I talking to people nowadays, like my peers who are students, and they'll tell me, I know what I want to say, I just don't know how to say it. I hear that all the time, especially whenever you're talking about philosophy or any of those subjects. Anything that's transcendent or deep, as people say, or difficult to grasp, people just don't really have the words for it, even their emotions and feelings. But when you learn rhetoric, you're actually able to articulately convey the meaning behind what you intend to say. You're not just saying words, you're conveying ideas. You're conveying the good, the true, and the beautiful. And this has been completely lost in modern school systems. We're not really learning how to convey our ideas. But what about actually studying? What do you study in classical education? Well, you still study the standard subjects. You're still studying literature. You're still studying history. You're studying science and math along with the trivium, and oftentimes the trivium is first and foundational so that you can actually engage with these subjects. Something else that is always present in classical education is philosophy, which we barely ever talk about in modern school systems. And you've probably come across the stereotype of the typical philosophy student. I've met my fair share of philosophy students, and many of them are wonderful, but there are the ones who tend to view everything as a metaphysical question and don't ever actually talk about anything real or engage with your ideas in good faith. But I think that stereotype is negative, and I think that it's not true en masse. I think philosophy is wonderful, even as someone who's not a philosophy major. And I think everyone should have some idea of philosophy, because how can you discern what is true or good or beautiful, or even discern what you believe without philosophy? Because empirical data does have its merits, but at some point it cannot prove what is good or what is true or what is beautiful. It cannot prove virtue. It cannot prove our societal structures or our culture. And those are pivotal to actually having a functioning society. And you also, whenever you're engaging with these other ideas, like science and math, you're not engaging with them at a lower level because you are a student of philosophy. You actually engage with them in a higher level. And it's this idea where there is a unison between all of the subjects as they're one education rather than completely segmented. Also, this model lets students grapple with dilemmas and ideas that are heavy and they might not always understand. And a lot of times you don't understand something, you have to go back, especially when you're reading these ancient texts from different times and these cultures that ended up shaping our own. It's difficult to know, so you have to learn the history behind these texts. You have to learn the ideas. There's a lot of learning that goes into understanding them that can help you form your own ideas in the modern day. Another thing that they stress is learning Latin and Greek. Now, I unfortunately haven't learned Latin. I'm hopefully taking it this semester as an elective in university. I got kicked out of my freshman Latin class. That's a story for a different time. I had to take Spanish. So I'm not the expert in Latin, but I am a Catholic and I do attend the Latin Mass. And as I learn Latin, ecclesiastical Latin, and most of it's church terms, but there are a lot of words where I realize these are the roots to the words that we use. And same with Greek. And both of these languages are foundational to every single language that we speak in the West. Now, the Romance languages, obviously Latin derived, the Cyrillic languages, Greek. You look at English and the Germanic languages and the influence that Latin has had on them. And when you understand the roots of words, your vocabulary can just explode. It's crazy how much more you can learn because you hear a word, you read it in context, especially when you're reading these great works. When you're reading Aristotle and you're in ninth grade and you've studied Latin and you've studied Greek, especially Greek, not Latin, but I guess Latin too, because when you're reading the English translations of Aristotle, there are Latin-derived words. But you can understand all of these fancy metaphysical terms and all of these crazy vocabulary words from, one, you have an understanding of grammar, but two, you have an understanding of Latin and Greek, at least to a basic extent, and then you understand syntax and how languages work. Another thing that classical education does is, because it is somewhat difficult, it builds intellectual resilience. And although I said there is more curiosity in this type of environment, so it's not as if it's harder for students to learn. Students at these type of schools, even nowadays, actually do wonderfully. But it is definitely more intellectually taxing. You have to think. You can't not think in these schools, or else you're not doing the work. So, why did we go away from this model if it's so great? And a lot of the stuff I'm saying is pretty easy to look up and double check. And a lot of this isn't just my opinion as a student. This is just I would say the reality, because I view things through this classical lens. But even from the pure scientific stance, a lot of it is backed up by data. And if we want to look historically at where this came from, well, we have to go back to the 19th, 20th centuries. And liberal arts started to slowly be phased out with this progressive mindset of building laborers and practical work. And you can get into all sorts of reasons why this happened with industrialization and such. And someone interesting to look into is John Dewey. He was very in favor of vocational work and practical training. Oftentimes his work is misrepresented, so you do have to read it in good faith. That is part of the classical education model. But regardless of what he intended, his arguments were very influential in shaping the system. And then you can look at the influence that the Rockefellers had in that as well. And you can start to see sometimes even a malicious pattern away from this. And whenever you look in the 1950s, then you really started to have the emergence of STEM and this idea of vocational training. And the University of Chicago actually published a great books set to almost combat this in the 50s, to say we need to go back. And there was a book written called The Great Conversation as the preface to this series that talked about all the reasons I'm mentioning now, why we have to go back to it. But it wasn't really successful. And well, there still are classical schools, and it is a wonderful series. And I don't mean it wasn't successful. Actually, it was successful in many ways, but it didn't shift the tide, that one series, or those thinkers and their ideas. But what this has resulted in is we have a lot of students now who I'm meeting. A lot of these kids are really smart and super skilled. They have really, really great tech skills, and they're not any dumber than the kids that were classically educated, but they don't have deeper habits of thinking. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's everything I talked about before, right? The ideas of logic and rhetoric and understanding ideas and grappling with them and fighting with them. Those are deeper habits of mind, habits of understanding. And they do have to be taught, because we are born with curiosity, but we're not born with these tools. We're not born with the trivium ingrained in our mind. That's why it took thousands of years to get to here for classical education, and we threw it away in the name of progressivism, industrialization, whatever you want to call it, whatever the reason. But regardless of that, I do think as a student who is in school right now, who just graduated high school, and who wants to teach in the future, that returning to classical education is a necessity, because without it, students don't have clarity in thought. They're unable to discern ideas. They don't understand where we came from. And a lot of times you're seeing people now don't have a sense of identity. I think a large part of that, even from discussing with other people, is that people don't know about our culture in the West or our intellectual tradition. And that's why as a student now, when I'm in my classes, I'm in my tutorials, and we're talking about things, and I just hear the same points over and over again. And anytime I bring up classical education as a rebuttal to that, I don't want to hear the same viewpoints over and over. I want people to think and engage. They'll say, well, the classical, it's just the same books over and over, so it's the same viewpoints. But it's not. A lot of times it is similar viewpoints. But whenever you have students who can actually logically think, and you can debate in good faith, and you have rhetoric, and you can reason, and you're all seeking a higher truth, then the conversations become so much more productive, and you actually build bridges between each other and can make real progress. Because history doesn't just work in a line where we're always making progress, but progress does occur. And there are some things from the past that are good, like classical education we should bring back, and other things like the Catholic Church and the Christian faith. I would argue we should bring that back as well in the West. It's part of our cultural tradition, and I would argue that it's good, true, and beautiful. But even apart from that, just any idea that you have, imagine if you could apply these principles to it. Would you change it? Maybe. I've changed ideas a ton. Who knows what I'm going to think in the next few years as I go through college and discernment in these intellectual ideas and read more of this great tradition, because there's always more. And that's the last thing, continued learning. That's a huge part of classical education. Most of the time people get out of school, they check out, they go to their job, and a lot of times it feels like we're stuck, we're stagnant, and we need something to pull us out, and I think that's going to be classical education. So those are my thoughts as a student on classical education. And in the future, I want to do a lot of work in this. And there's a ton of schools doing great work in this. There's big networks of Catholic schools that do classical education. There's the Hillsdale network of schools, Cincinnati Classical Academy, one of the best among them. And I've worked a little bit with people in that school, talked to them. I'm close with some of them. Brilliant people that are working at that school. So if you're interested at all, and I would check that out if anyone even sees my rant about this. But that is all I have on classical education for now. I will probably at some point start to give more of my ideas on how we can optimize it or whatnot, or my shifting views, but that's all I have for today. God bless. Thank you for watching.